Here is something that will make you stop and truly listen. On this night, the night when bells sang of hope being born, I lost everything I once believed to be sacred. Not on a battlefield, not through the betrayal of enemies, but in the silence of my own home, beside the one with whom I once prayed. This is not a story about a crown, and not about politics. This is a story about how faith collapses when the betrayal is not only of a person, but of the very order you believed in with all your heart. By the end of this story, you will hear how a king and a beggar became equal on the cold stone of a chapel before a God who does not ask for titles. You will understand why betrayal wounds not only as a sin, but as a spiritual earthquake, and why, sometimes, the greatest revelation comes not from a throne, but from one who has nothing. If this is your first time here, do not rush. Listen, and take a moment to like and subscribe if these stories truly speak to you, but only if what I do here genuinely resonates with you. And if this story touches you, leave your mark and introduce yourself. Tell us where you are watching from and what time it is in your city right now. I believe words carry weight when people gather around them, even when hundreds of miles and different nights separate us. Thank you for being here. Now let us walk into this moment together. Into the night when a king and a beggar prayed side by side. I have ruled this valley long enough to know the sound of honest winter, the clean snap of river ice, the slow groan of pine boughs under snow, the way a torch's flame leans and trembles when the wind has teeth. A kingdom tells the truth in its weather. Men do, too, though we spend our lives learning new ways to disguise it. They call me your grace in the hall, sire on the road, and, when the priests think I am not listening, the Lord's anointed, as if oil on my brow sealed every doubt inside my skull. I used to believe it did. I used to think my marriage did, too. My queen came to me the way spring comes to a hard country, not gentle, but certain. She was the daughter of a neighboring duke, raised on Latin prayers and the sharp arithmetic of alliances. Her hair was the color of chestnuts held close to a fire. Her laughter, God help me, could make even a seasoned knight forget the weight of his mail. When we were first wed, the court spoke of us as if we were a hymn. They said our match would knit wounds closed between rival houses, that our children would be proof the Lord still favored this land. I smiled and accepted their blessing like a man accepts a cloak in cold weather, grateful, a little proud, and foolishly sure it would never tear. But cloth does tear, even sacred cloth. It began so quietly, I almost hate myself for noticing, because noticing is the first step toward knowing, and knowing is the first step toward losing. The queen's devotions became performative. She knelt at mass with hands folded like carved ivory, and yet her eyes wandered, not upward toward heaven, but sideways, toward the choir loft, the side doors, the places where shadows move. She stopped asking after the poor, stopped insisting the kitchens send stew to the leper house on the hill. Once she had been the one to remind me of mercy when taxes ran high and winter ran longer than our patience. Now, when I spoke of alms, she would purse her lips and say, "We cannot feed every mouth, my lord. If we try, we will starve our own," as if charity were a ledger to be balanced. At table she began to praise men she once barely tolerated. A certain smooth-tongued cleric, Brother Matthew, sent to advise on church matters, could do no wrong in her telling. A young captain from the Eastern Marches, handsome in that shallow way that makes women defend him and men dislike him, suddenly merited her laughter, her attention, her little private smiles. And if I looked at her too long, if I tried to catch her in the act of forgetting she belonged beside me, she would turn those same warm eyes on me and ask, lightly, "Are you unwell, husband? You stare as if you've seen a ghost." There were other signs, small, sharp things that pricked like burrs. A ribbon missing from her prayer book, a wax seal on a letter that wasn't mine, the faint scent of wine on her breath at dawn when she claimed she'd been fasting. I told myself it was court life. I told myself I was tired, suspicious, growing old before my time. Because what else does a king tell himself when the foundation stones of his world begin to shift? If I am honest, if this is truly a confession and not a performance, I must admit the worst part. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted, desperately, to be the kind of man who never doubts his wife, never doubts God's order, never doubts the story everyone else depends upon. And so, when the first crack appeared in the holy things, I pretended it was only frost on the window. The first whisper reached me through a man who swore he had none. Old Sir Aldrich, my chamberlain, had served my father and still spoke as if every sentence were an oath. He came at dusk with his cap in his hands, knuckles white around the brim, and said only, "Sire, the corridors are louder than they ought to be." I laughed, too quickly, too loudly, then closed the doors. His eyes didn't follow my jest. Doors do not close tongues. That night, I walked the gallery above the great hall alone, where the tapestries hang thick as forests and the stone sweats cold behind them. Below, the court drank spiced ale and pretended at cheer. I listened, not like a king, but like a husband with his ear pressed to a wall, ashamed of how desperate he'd become. Names drifted up through the music. Brother Matthew, Captain Remy. The Queen was seen at Compline and then not seen again. A lantern in the west stair. A laugh in the cloister. Nothing clean enough to seize. Nothing solid enough to punish. Only the awful shape of suggestion. I told myself it was envy. Courtiers feed on scandal the way wolves feed on weakness. Yet when I went to my chambers, I found my queen's maid, Avellini, kneeling by the hearth as if praying. Her cheeks were wet. When she noticed me, she wiped them too fast. "What troubles you?" I asked. She swallowed. "Nothing, my lord." It was the same answer everyone gives when the truth would cost them bread. I looked past her. On the queen's table sat a small coffer I had not seen before. Plain oak, iron bands, no crest. It was not royal work. It was traveling work, made to be hidden beneath a cloak. "What is that?" I asked. Avellini's fingers tightened in her lap. "Her Grace's devotionals." I stepped closer. The coffer smelled faintly of resin and horse sweat. A journey's scent. I lifted the lid. Inside lay a prayer book. Yes, but not hers. The binding was scuffed, masculine, the corners softened by use. Pressed between its pages was a scrap of vellum with writing so hurried the ink had bitten deep. It was not a psalm. It was not scripture. It was a message, and it began with a familiarity that struck like a slap. "My bright mercy." My throat went dry. I read the next line and felt something in me tilt, as if the world's floor had shifted a finger's breadth and would never settle again. There were promises there. Meetings. A mention of the west stair. A mention, sweet Christ, of confession made not to God but to her, as if she were the one who absolved. Avellini made a small sound, like a trapped bird. "Sire, please." I wanted to roar. I wanted to fling the book into the fire and watch the words curl and vanish. Instead, I closed the coffer carefully, because kings are trained to move slowly when their hearts are on fire. "Whose book is this?" I asked, and my voice did not sound like mine. She stared at the stones. "I do not know." I thought of the whispering names. I thought of the Queen's eyes sliding sideways in Massachusetts. I thought of the way she'd begun to talk of mercy as if it were weakness. "Send her to me," I said. "And if she asks why?" I looked at Avellini then, really looked, and saw fear not just for herself, but for me, as if she already knew what this knowledge would do. "Tell her," I said softly, "that I have found what was hidden." She did not come at once. That, too, was a kind of answer. I waited while the candles shortened themselves and the draft traced cold fingers along the floor. When she finally entered, she wore her calm like armor, green wool gown, hair braided neatly, a queen prepared for ritual rather than truth. "You sent for me," she said, as if we were discussing accounts. I placed the coffer between us. "I found this." Her eyes flicked to it. Only a blink, but enough. "You went through my things." Already the ground shifted. Not denial. Accusation. "I am your husband," I said. "And your king." She smiled thinly. "So you remind me." I opened the book and read aloud the first line. Her breath caught. Then she recovered and laughed. Actually laughed, and crossed herself. "Is this what troubles you? A foolish letter?" Men write foolishly when they imagine holiness excuses passion. "Whose book is it?" "A cleric's." "Many clerics visit court. Do they call you my bright mercy?" She looked away, then back. "Words are not sins. Meetings are." Silence stretched. Then her voice hardened. "You were never present, you know. Always councils. Always borders. Always God's burdens placed on your shoulders. Am I to rot in prayer while you rule? So it is my fault. I did not say that. You did not have to. She began to pace. You think fidelity is silence. I was lonely. I sought counsel. In the west stair? Her face flushed. People saw what they wanted. And the captain? She stopped. Remy is nothing. You praise him often. Because you never praise anyone. The words spilled now, tumbling over one another, each one shifting blame, sanding truth down until nothing sharp remained. She spoke of neglect, of duty, of how men stray in war and are forgiven, of how queens are expected to be marble. At last I asked, "Did you betray me?" She met my eyes and said, carefully, "I have never lain with another man." It was an answer shaped like a door left open. "And your vows?" I asked. "They were misunderstood," she said. "By you. By God, perhaps." That was when something broke, not loudly, not cleanly. Just a quiet fracture deep inside, where faith and love had once leaned against each other for support. "Leave me," I said. She hesitated, then inclined her head, all dignity restored. At the door she paused. "You are not blameless," she said. "History will remember that." When she was gone, I sat alone with the coffer and felt the crown on my head grow impossibly heavy, as if it were pressing me down toward the stone, toward the truth that kings, too, can be made small. Anger came first, as it always does. Hot, righteous, loud in the blood. It told me I had been wronged, that justice demanded spectacle, banishment, imprisonment, the clean violence of law. Anger is generous that way. It offers simple solutions to complicated grief. I paced the chamber like a caged animal, rehearsing sentences I would never speak aloud. I am king. I am betrayed. I will be obeyed. Each phrase rang hollow the moment it struck the air, like coins minted from tin instead of silver. When the heat passed, humiliation took its place. That was worse. I thought of the court, the way eyes lingered, the way silence had learned my name. I imagined the whispers turning sharper now, emboldened by truth. Even his own wife would not submit to his rule. Even God did not guard his marriage. I had faced armies without flinching, but the idea of being pitted by my own servants made my stomach knot. I went to the chapel then, not to pray, but to stand somewhere sacred and hope it would explain itself. The candles burned low, their wax pooled like small white graves. I knelt because the body remembers what the mind forgets. The words would not come. Every prayer I knew felt compromised, as if they had passed through her mouth and come back to me spoiled. I accused God, silently, of absence, of negligence, of designing vows that break men before they save them. Then grief arrived, not dramatic, not noble, just heavy. It settled behind my eyes and in my chest. I grieved the woman I thought I knew. I grieved the future I had spoken aloud so many times it had felt ordained. Children, peace, a queen who would kneel beside me without secrets between us. Worst of all, I grieved certainty. If my marriage could fracture so quietly, what else was false? The anointing oil? The promises of providence? The idea that kings rule by divine consent and not merely by force and habit? I felt like a boy again, listening to sermons and believing that obedience produced clarity, that virtue protected what mattered. That night, alone in the royal chambers, I removed my crown and set it on the table. The mark it left on my brow throbbed. I understood, suddenly, why men abandon thrones not for power but for silence. To be king is to have no place to lay down your doubt. I did not sleep. I watched the darkness thin at the edges and wondered whether faith, like marriage, was only as strong as the honesty it was built upon, and whether mine had just collapsed beyond repair. Christmas Eve arrived without announcement, like a guest no one had prepared for. The bells rang as they always had, bronze voices calling the faithful to warmth and order, but their sound scraped against me. Joy, when you are hollowed out, feels like mockery. The court dressed itself in ritual. Evergreen boughs lined the hall. Candles multiplied until shadows had nowhere left to hide. My queen took her place beside me, serene as stone, her hands folded, her face composed into something history would later mistake for innocence. No one would ever write of how far apart we sat on that bench. though our sleeves nearly touched. She spoke to me once. Only once. "You look tired," she said, softly, so the words could pass for concern. "I am awake," I replied. She nodded, as if that explained everything. At supper I could not eat. Each carol felt invasive, each blessing a test I was failing publicly. When the priest spoke of the Holy Family, of trust, of obedience, of a young woman who told the truth to an angel, I felt my jaw tighten until it ached. After the meal, tradition demanded I lead the midnight prayers in the lower chapel, the one built into the old stone before this castle learned to be proud. I considered refusing. I considered feigning illness. Instead, I did what kings are trained to do when their insides are breaking. I obeyed expectation. I did not wear my crown. I told the guards to remain behind. I wrapped myself in a plain cloak and walked alone through the cold corridors, my breath a small white thing that vanished as soon as it appeared. Somewhere above me, laughter followed the wine. Somewhere behind me, my queen resumed her performance. The chapel door stood open. Inside, the air smelled of wax and damp stone. Only a few candles burned, their flames bowed low, as if even light felt the weight of the night. I knelt in the back, where kings do not belong, and bowed my head. I tried to pray for forgiveness. Nothing came. I tried to pray for clarity. Silence answered. What came instead was a question I had never allowed myself to ask. If God sees all things, what does he see when he looks at me now? Not the crown, not the marriage, just a man stripped of certainty, kneeling because he has nowhere else to go. I stayed like that longer than I should have, long enough for the cold to seep through the stone and into my bones, long enough for the chapel to forget I was there. That was when I heard someone else breathe. At first I thought it was my own breath echoing back to me, some trick of stone and sorrow. Then I heard it again, slow, uneven, close enough that it startled me upright. I turned, half expecting a guard who had disobeyed orders, or a priest come to correct my posture before God. It was neither. A beggar knelt 2 paces away. He was wrapped in rags that had once been a blanket, the kind the monasteries give out when winter grows cruel and supplies thin. His boots were cracked, his beard tangled with frost. One hand shook as he pressed it to the floor for balance. The other clutched a small wooden cross, so worn it had lost its corners. He did not look at me. That was the first mercy. I did not know anyone else was here, I said, because silence had begun to feel dangerous. He nodded, still facing the altar. I come late. Less eyes that way. I almost told him to leave. Not out of cruelty, but habit. This was royal space, sacred space, ordered space. Then it struck me how absurd that thought was, kneeling on stone before a god who had been born in a stable. "You may stay," I said. "I wasn't asking," he replied, not unkindly. I waited for recognition to flicker across his face. It never did. Either he truly did not know me, or he knew and did not care. Both possibilities unsettled me more than reverence would have. We knelt in silence. I became aware of small sounds, the crackle of a candle, the pop of wax, the beggar's breath hitching as if pain accompanied every inhale. I wondered what had brought him here on this night of all nights. Hunger? Habit? Desperation? Or something more faithful than anything I had managed? After a while he whispered, "You've lost something." It was not a question. I almost laughed. "Everyone has." "Yes," he said, "but some losses sit louder." I studied him then, the deep lines around his eyes, the way his hands trembled not just from cold, but from age or injury. "And what have you lost?" I asked. "My wife," he said simply. "Before winter. Before forgiveness." The word struck too close. "I am sorry." He shrugged. "So is God, I think. But sorry doesn't always put things back." We prayed then, not aloud, not together, but beside one another. 2 men bent under different weights, equalized by stone and silence. For the first time since the truth had found me, my chest loosened. Not healed, just less alone. When the bells began to ring above us, announcing the birth of hope to a world that rarely deserves it, the beggar crossed himself and stood with effort. "Thank you for the warmth," he said. "For the company," I replied. He paused, finally looking at me. His eyes were sharp, knowing, and utterly unafraid. "Kings and beggars," he said, "kneel the same height." Then he turned and shuffled out into the cold, leaving me with a truth no sermon had ever dared to give me. I remained kneeling long after the beggar's steps faded, as if rising too quickly might undo what little steadiness I had found. His words lodged in me, not like comfort, but like a stone placed carefully to mark a grave. Kneel the same height. I had spent my life arranging the world, so that was never true. When I finally stood, my joints protested. Age, I told myself, though grief ages a man faster than years. I left the chapel by the side door and walked without direction, letting the corridors choose for me. The bells still rang above, jubilant, insistent. They could not drown the quiet reckoning now taking shape in my chest. By the time I returned to my chambers, dawn had begun its pale negotiations with night. My queen was there. She sat by the window, unbraided hair loose around her shoulders, as if she had chosen vulnerability for armor. The sight of her struck me harder than anger ever had. I saw, suddenly, how tired she looked, how cornered, how human. "Where were you?" she asked. "Praying," I said. She smiled faintly. "You never did that long." "I never needed to." She rose and came closer. "This can still be managed," she said. "No one needs to know more than they already do. We can say there was illness, a misunderstanding. Time will dull it." I thought of the beggar's wife. "Before forgiveness." "No," I said. Her face tightened. "You would ruin us both." "We are already ruined," I replied. "The question is whether we lie about it." She grew angry then, sharp, brittle. "You want punishment. For me. For yourself. This is pride, not holiness." "Perhaps," I said, "but it is honest." She searched my face for leverage and found none. At last she turned away. "What will you do?" I looked at the crown on the table, at the window, at the pale morning revealing a city that would wake soon, unaware its king had changed. "I will step aside," I said. "Not forever, but long enough to remember who I am when no one bows." She laughed, once, harshly. "You think that will save you?" "No," I said. "I think it will save what's left of me." When she left, she did not look back. I ordered my brother summoned. I wrote letters with a steady hand. Regent. Separation. Pilgrimage. The words felt strange and right at once. Power, I learned, loosens its grip the moment you stop mistaking it for identity. As the sun climbed, I knelt again, not as king, not as husband, but as a man finally stripped to truth. And for the first time since betrayal found me, I did not feel forsaken. By noon the court knew. Not everything, never everything, but enough. A king does not vanish quietly, even when he tries. Servants whispered. Lords measured their words. The priests looked at me as if I were a wound they were not trained to heal. I dressed myself. That alone felt like rebellion. No valet, no sword-bearer, no man whose job was to remind me who I was supposed to be. I chose a plain tunic, a traveler's cloak, boots without ornament. When I caught my reflection in the polished shield by the door, I barely recognized the man staring back. He looked lighter, not happier, just unburdened of theater. Before I left, I returned once more to the lower chapel. It was empty now, cold, ordinary, the place where something extraordinary had passed without announcement. I knelt where the beggar had knelt and pressed my palm to the stone, half expecting warmth to linger. Nothing did. That, too, felt honest. I walked out through the eastern gate as merchants were arriving, their carts creaking, their breath steaming. No one bowed. One man glanced at me and then away, dismissing me as another pilgrim, another winter fool chasing meaning along frozen roads. I cannot tell you what that anonymity did to me. It frightened me. It freed me. As I passed the poor quarter, I saw faces I had once known only as numbers. Alms distributed, taxes forgiven, bodies buried after harsh seasons. A woman argued with a baker. A child laughed at nothing. A man slept in a doorway, wrapped in rags much like the beggars. I wondered if he prayed. I wondered if I would. Outside the walls, the road stretched pale and uncertain. Each step carried me farther from judgment and closer to consequence. I did not know where I would sleep. I did not know if my faith would survive the journey. I only knew that lies had cost me everything I thought I was, and truth, however painful, was the only coin left worth carrying. I thought again of the beggar's words. Kings and beggars kneel the same height. Perhaps that was the miracle of Christmas. Not angels, not certainty, but the leveling of men before a God who chose a manger over a throne. As the wind cut through my cloak and the city receded behind me, I whispered a prayer without title or demand. "Teach me how to walk humbly," I said, and for the first time, the road did not feel empty. The road taught me faster than any tutor ever had. It taught me how cold finds the gaps in your clothing and how hunger sharpens memory. It taught me how quickly a man becomes invisible when he no longer carries authority like a banner. I learned the price of bread. I learned the sound of my own footsteps when no one else waited for me to pass. Some nights I slept in barns, some in monasteries, some beneath hedges crusted with frost. When I was asked my name, I gave none. When I was asked my station, I said only, a penitent. No one questioned that. The world is full of them, though few wear crowns beneath their cloaks. I prayed differently then. Not formally, not beautifully. I spoke to God the way a man speaks when he has already lost the argument. I admitted my anger, my jealousy, my relief at being away from her. That last truth surprised me most. Love, I learned, can curdle into duty long before it dies, and sometimes betrayal only reveals what has been decaying in silence. At a small priory near the river, a monk offered me soup and asked what sin had driven me to the road. "My marriage," I said. He nodded, as if I'd confessed to pride or gluttony. "Ah, a common one. Can it be forgiven?" I asked. He stirred the pot. "Forgiven? Often. Healed? Less so." That night I dreamed of the chapel, of stone, of two men kneeling side by side. I woke with tears frozen at my temples and did not wipe them away. Word reached me, eventually, carried by travelers who did not know they were speaking to the man they described. My brother ruled steadily. The court had settled into its new fiction. My queen lived still within the walls, dignified, solitary, spoken of carefully. No scandal bloomed. No justice thundered. History, it seemed, preferred quiet compromises. I was asked, by a priest, by a farmer, by my own reflection, whether mercy required my return, whether forgiveness demanded restoration. I had no answer. What I knew was this: mercy given for applause is not mercy at all. It is performance. And I had performed enough holiness to last a lifetime. On the eve of Epiphany, I knelt in a roadside shrine, snow drifting in through the broken roof, and released her, not from consequence, not from truth, but from my need to be vindicated. I did the same for myself. The prayer was clumsy, incomplete, but it was mine. And somewhere in the silence that followed, I understood that humility is not thinking less of oneself. It is finally seeing oneself clearly, without titles to distort the view. I returned in spring, not in procession, not announced. I arrived as pilgrims do, mud on my boots, sunburn on my face, thinner than the man who had left at Christmas. The city gates stood open. Life had not waited for my understanding to catch up. My brother met me privately. He embraced me without ceremony and did not ask if I was healed. Wise men rarely ask questions that have no honest answers. The crown was returned to me that day, set gently on the table between us like an object neither of us fully trusted anymore. I did not put it on at once. As for my queen, no chronicle will tell this rightly, so I will. We spoke once more, quietly, without witnesses. There were no accusations left to trade. Only truth, finally stripped of strategy. We agreed to live apart, bound by law but freed from illusion. Mercy, I learned, does not always reconcile. Sometimes it only releases. On my first night back as king, I went again to the lower chapel. I knelt where I had knelt before, on the same cold stone. I half expected the beggar to be there, or some sign that the night which broke me had not been a dream. There was nothing, and yet everything was different. I prayed without bargaining, without posture. I prayed as a man who knew now that love can fail, vows can fracture, and God does not prevent every ruin we beg him to. But I also prayed as a man who had knelt beside another soul with nothing to offer but shared need, and found that enough. I rose and placed the crown on my head, not as proof of divine favor, not as armor against betrayal, but as a burden I now understood was temporary, conditional, and equalizing in its own strange way. For one day, the beggar and I would both be dust. On one night, we had both been simply men. If I rule more gently now, it is because I have been humbled without being destroyed. If I believe more carefully, it is because faith survived honesty. And if I love more truthfully, it is because I have learned this at last. Before God, there are no kings and no beggars, only souls, kneeling the same height, praying not to be spared suffering, but to be made faithful within it.